Hi. I had some people who couldn't hear me so well on the last video that I did on my tablet, so I plugged in this microphone. I know there's some pretty crazy headphones, but that's what I got. I was just going to discuss this book by Richard Rubenstein, When Jesus Became God. So this is discussing the Arian controversy. And in the Arian controversy, they were discussing whether Jesus was the creator God or whether he was begotten of God, but both sides believed that he was always with God, like he was pre existing. I don't believe he was pre existing. So I'm thinking whatever happened to Christianity happened before the Arian controversy, but it's interesting. I just want to read some more stuff about what happened before this, but this is around 300 AD that this stuff was going on. So Christianity sort of just morphed into something Gnostic um, less than 300 years after Jesus died, which I find interesting. So I'm going to read some of this, but I don't want to read too much of it. You know, if you really like it, you can buy the book, but I'll also leave a link below to Amazon.com with this book. And there are some excerpts of pages that you can read yourself. Let's see here. Not going to do a direct quote, but from page 18, it talks about how in the first 2 centuries after Christ's death, the Romans thought that Christianity was just a weird version of Judaism. So it wasn't like a whole separate religion. It was Judaism. It was just a little weird. So I found that very interesting that the first 2 centuries after his death, it was more like Judaism, and now it's like a completely different religion. Also, later on in the book, it talks about how they were already doing the Eucharist, and the Eucharist isn't even from the Bible. That's not, that's like a perverted thing. Um, Based on my Bible studies the past year, I really believe that Jesus said, that his food was to do the will of him who sent him. So that would mean the daily bread is to do God's will. And that's what the Our Father prayer says, give us this day our daily bread, so that we can do your will. Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So it's about doing God's will for communion. It's not about eating a cookie. So I'll leave some links below for that. All right, so there's already around this time lots of different heresies, if you want to call them that. I'm not going to say that they're going to go to hell for doing it, but it's not what Jesus supposedly taught, you know. All right, page 19 starts to discuss some women, the Christian women. Then, to the persecution called further attention to the differences between Christian and pagan leadership. The list of those executed for refusing to offer the required sacrifices included a number of the church's most famous bishops: Fabian and Sixtus II of Rome, Babelas of Antioch, Alexander of Jerusalem, Caprian of Carthage, and others. Although the great majority of lay people and many churchmen played it safe, the heroism of a few was a more potent public influence than the compromises of many. Particularly notable was the bravery of Christian women. Bishop Dionysius of Alexandria, who barely escaped martyrdom himself, describes how a local mob worked up to a bloodthirsty pitch by the authorities, quote, seized the wonderful old lady Apollonia, battered her till they knocked out all her teeth, built a pyre in front of the city, and threatened to burn her alive unless she repeated after them their heathen incantations. She asked for a breathing space, and when they released her, jumped without hesitation into the fire, was burnt to ashes. Women, in fact, were the Christians' secret weapon in their struggle to win converts in all classes of Roman society, including the respectable upper classes. Overall, it is highly unlikely that women were a clear majority in the churches of the 3rd century. There were several reasons for this. Christianity was not a feminist movement in the modern sense, but the community's yearning for sexual purity operated to the advantage of those long relegated to the status of sexual playthings or childbearing vessels. Although the church shared the strong patriarchal bias of Roman society, it protected widows, a large group because of girls' early marriages to older men, cherished virgins, considered adultery by either spouse a serious sin, opposed prostitution, and tried to prevent men from putting off their wives. It enabled women to play leading roles in the Christian community, and perhaps most important, considered them no less capable than men of winning eternal life. Right, skipping down a little bit. An esoteric sect or protest group on the margins of society could be terrorized out of existence, but Christian thought had deeper social and psychological roots. It reflected a new consciousness, widely shared, of people's capacity for internal growth and change. The pagan world was a world of externalities, in which religious rites were a feature of one's public life, as a member of a traditional civic collective. Christianity, by contrast, expressed a new sense of interiority, the perception of an inner space in which an individual could struggle with the devil, communicate with God, and discover his or her own spiritual identity. The Christian message had a profound appeal to the increasing number of Romans dissatisfied with frozen public rituals and seeking a God with whom one could be alone. This reminds me of when Jesus said, "Don't pray out in public." And we talked about that with the Together 2016 event that happened this past summer, where all these supposed Christians got together in public and prayed publicly. And that's where people are going back to. But what Christianity had different was that it wasn't public. It was a personal relationship with God. And Jesus said, pray in your prayer closet in private, and your Father will answer you openly. So I thought that was interesting that they were happy with the fact that it was private, and now everybody's trying to make Christianity more public. I'm skipping ahead to the next chapter. All right. Quote, would the Roman world rid itself of the plagues that had begun to threaten it? Sorry, let me say where I'm at. This is concerning a sacrifice at Apollo's temple. They would go to the temple and then they would sacrifice animals and they would ask questions. And the diviners would look at the animals and divine what the answers to the questions were. Okay. So would the Roman world rid itself of the plagues that had begun to threaten it, like the judgments of angry gods? Such questions could be answered by the haruspices, priests who had mastered the art of divining the future by examining the entrails of sacrificed animals. Kind of like tea leaf readers, except with animals. The huge crowd gathered outside the temple strained for a glimpse of the ceremonies through the colonnaded portico, glad at least to hear en masse what few could see. One can imagine the priests chanting in unison and the libations poured out on the thirsty ground, the knives flashing, the death moans of flawless bullocks and sheep, and the blood washed away by a gush of water through the conduits laid beneath the temple floor. Several minutes of silence followed within and without while the exposed hearts, livers, and other organs were studied by the priests. Then disquieting murmurs. Something was wrong. Incredulous voices were raised on the floor out of the crowd's view. Finally, when all chatter had ceased, the ceremonies were repeated. Once more, the priests could be heard chanting, while animals without blemish went complaining to their deaths. The huge assemblage seemed almost to hold its breath, while the blood was again washed away and the diviners went to work. This time their dismay was unmistakable. The results of both sacrifices were, without exception, abnormal. 5-chambered hearts, livers without lobes, exploded intestines. Either some unimaginable disaster threatened Rome or something had happened to corrupt the ceremonies. Galerius, well known for his religious zeal, questioned the master of haruspices closely to determine the cause of the disastrous divination. The answer he received was infuriating but convincing. Alert priests had reported that each time the sacrifices were made, several of the emperor's household servants had made an occult sign in the air, the sign of the cross. Clearly, this black magic had ruined the ceremonies. There was no other credible explanation. Neither Diocletian nor Galerius doubted that the mysterious sign had power. They differed with Christians only about whether it was power for good or evil. Nor did Christians question the universally accepted belief that unseen powers, among them angels and demons, were active for good and evil in the human world. Obviously, these supernatural beings affected people's health, moods, and relationships, as well as influencing divinations and other events. The emperor's reaction to the corrupted ceremony was, in any case, immediate. All members of the imperial court, from household maids to the highest officials, were commanded to sacrifice to the immortal gods. Those who refused to do so would be dismissed without further notice. Furthermore, all members of the army were to do the same, or else resign their commissions. The Great Persecution, Rome's final attempt to stamp out the Christian faith, had taken its first step. All right, just a little bit down. The Caesar Galerius despised the Christians who dared deify a common criminal properly executed for disloyalty to Rome. Of course, speaking of Jesus. He took real pleasure in punishing the seditious Jews' followers. What angered his senior colleague, however, was not so much the Christians' particular beliefs as their exclusivism, their apparent inability to respect other people's gods. Take monotheism, for example. Diocletian cannot fathom why the belief in one God should separate the followers of Jesus from other Romans. By this time, many pagans had also come to believe in a supreme God, but they saw no reason to deny the existence and usefulness of less powerful deities, or to call them demons as the Christians did. Didn't the emperor require assistance in ruling his earthly empire? Why then should the Christians assert as an inflexible dogma that the Creator ruled the entire universe alone, or more confusingly still with his Son? To question the existence of other gods, worse yet, to brand them demonic spirits, was rude and divisive. A Roman who worshipped the Olympian gods would never call a devotee of Serapis or Isis an atheist or a demon worshipper. On the contrary, courtesy and common sense dictated making a place for other people's gods in one's own temple, and paying them the respects all divine beings were due. Why insult one's neighbors by denigrating their deities? And since all the gods might exist, why take the risk of angering any of them? The Christians' attitude seemed fanatical, like that of the Jews who made the suicidal mistake twice of rebelling against Rome's authority over Palestine. How could one deal with such fanatics except by force? Then there was the issue of worship. Many Romans found the Christians' refusal to take part in civic rituals unreasonable. Sorry, Dakota. Unreasonable. Where was I? Dakota, come on. Go sit down. Sorry. Then there was the issue of worship. Many Romans found the Christians' refusal to take part in civic rituals unreasonable, even in time of war unpatriotic, since there seemed no reason not to participate other than sheer arrogance and fanaticism. For most believers in the old gods and goddesses, participation in sacrificial rites was little more than a time-honored formality. It was a civic duty, something like the modern custom of saluting the flag. If you haven't, I've got a video. You can see it on saluting the flag. I don't believe Christians should be pledging allegiance to the flag. All right. For most people, pagan religion was not really a religion at all in the sense of a systematic theology, a transcendental ethic, or a quest for personal salvation. One's core beliefs and the state of one's heart had little to do with it. For centuries, Roman citizens had paid their respects to assorted deities without compromising more intense personal commitments. Why violate the custom now, at a time when civic unity and divine favor were so vital to the health of the empire? What most pagan leaders, even those as far-seeing as Diocletian, could not comprehend was the fact that the Christians had not merely added another god to the pantheon, they had redefined religion itself. Their God was an infinitely righteous but merciful parent, his son an eternally loving and faithful friend. To call a Christian fanatical for refusing to sacrifice to other gods was like calling a monogamous lover fanatical for refusing to pay court to other men or women. Just a little pinch of incense, why not just a little infidelity? In religion, as in love, the only sacrifice that mattered was the gift of oneself voluntarily offered on the altar of fidelity. All right. On page 33, when they would go to the oracle of Apollo, then, quote, Apollo responded to questioners by making indecipherable noises that were translated or interpreted by a learned priest, both figures standing out of sight in the recesses of the cavern. According to a later recollection of Constantine the Great, then a young officer attached to Diocletian's court, it was as if the god himself spoke from deep within the earth. Apollo could no longer prophesy through oracles. The voice moaned because, quote, the righteous on earth, end quote, were interfering with his communications with human beings. The righteous on earth, the emperor had no doubt whom that phrase was intended to describe. On February 23rd, 303, during an ancient Roman festival significantly called Terminalia, they posted an edict banning Christian worship and ordering churches throughout the empire to be pulled down. Church officials were ordered to hand over their sacred books for burning. Ritual objects were to be confiscated by the imperial treasury. Christians who refused to abandon their faith were deprived of all privileges, in particular, the immunity of upper-class citizens from torture. Christian slaves could not be freed, or if already freed, must be returned to servitude. And the decree provided no one had a right to use the law courts unless he first sacrificed to the gods, so practicing Christians would be defenseless against personal assaults and seizures of their property. These were harsh measures, but Diocletian did not at this point order mass arrests or executions of Christians. He wanted to impoverish the church, divide it, and terrorize its most influential supporters. Nevertheless, as the campaign gathered momentum, violence was inevitable, especially when Christians actively resisted their persecution. So I find it interesting. Once again, they're looking for, sacred books and ritual objects. If you go by the Bible, we don't really have any ritual objects. So, it seems again to be pointing to the fact that they're already talking about a group of supposed Christians that are already idolizing, things, having ritual objects. Jesus told us to walk the way he walked. And you don't need an object to do that. Communion, I've got a playlist on the Daily Bread, and I'll leave that link below. Just it's just so frustrating to think that just 300 years after Jesus was dead, they're already doing this stuff when this is nothing that the Bible is talking about. Sacred books, I mean, that's got to be the Bible or scriptures, right? I guess books of the Bible. There are people that just couldn't read. People were saved without a book, without books of the Bible. People really they keep idolizing things like a book, paper. It came from wood, God wants us not to idolize books and not to have little items and things. He's the living God. He lives always inside of us. He lives. God is spirit. It's not a book that saves you. It's not an item that saves you. We're supposed to be worshiping the living God, and that's who Jesus worshipped. And he said he didn't even have a place to rest his head. It's just frustrating to see that the church has gone so far off, and this is only 300 years after he died. After talking about Peter, being hoisted up naked, torn with loaded whips, and having vinegar and salt added to those wounds, and being placed on a pyre till he was dead. Quote, most Christian lay people were not faced with Peter's choice, since the persecution was not yet aimed at them. The question of resistance was posed most painfully to the clergy, who faced the possibility of death if they refused to surrender sacred texts and ritual objects on command. As Eusebius's text suggests, there was no fixed penalty for disobedience. A contumacious Christian might be put to work in the mines of Palestine, or have an eye put out, or the muscles of one leg severed. Later, these marks of mutilation would become badges of distinction. The forms of torture were gruesomely diverse. Even the forms of execution lay in the discretion of local officials. Martyrdom could take the form of hanging, beheading, crucifixion, burning, flaying alive, strangling, or any other measure the authorities considered an appropriate response to rebellious behavior and a salutary lesson to others. These punishments were cruel, but not wantonly so. Their purpose was to take advantage of the Christian leaders' new state of mind. This is speaking of like the priests and stuff. So the Christian leaders' new state of mind, which was more future-oriented, political, and compromising than before. The clergy were no longer a handful of God-intoxicated souls anticipating the imminent end of the world and ready, even eager, to follow their master to the cross. Some, of course, fit this description. Bishop Anthithemes of Nicodemia refused to cooperate with the authorities and was beheaded in 303, as were several churchmen in Egypt and North Africa. But the majority of church leaders, as well as their congregants, had become too successful, ambitious, and adaptive to play the role of otherworldly martyrs. They understood that if the church could survive this persecution, as it had previous terror campaigns, its position as the leading alternative to official paganism would be greatly strengthened. A number of bishops and deacons therefore handed over Bibles and chalices to the authorities as ordered. Later, many of them would be called traitors, after the Latin word for handers over, traditores. And the church would split bitterly over the question of their authority to perform their priestly functions. Other clergymen convinced ignorant or unconcerned officials to accept heretical works or even medical textbooks in place of holy books. In the same way, when Christian clergy and then lay people were required to sacrifice to the gods, a few refused, point blank, and were brutally punished. But many more went through the motions, persuaded someone else to sacrifice for them, or absented themselves altogether with the connivance of sympathetic officials. There was a zealous priest named Donatus, and the people who followed him were Donatists. And the Donatists thought that if you were a bishop or a priest and you had given in and sacrificed, when you were told to sacrifice to these pagan gods, that you shouldn't really be in the position of a priest. And that's understandable. Again, we're not even supposed to be like that. Having these people over us, we're all supposed to be like one, like the time of Acts, where they all working together underneath the guidance of Jesus. Instead, these people have created this whole clergy stepladder, of people that are above others. And again, this just all seems like heretical stuff that just wasn't supposed to be there originally. But, in the 300s, this is where they were already at. So the Donatists wanted the priests who had given in to sacrifice to pagan gods and given away the sacred texts and all that stuff to not be in those positions anymore. And Bishop Peter in 306 wrote a letter basically forgive and forget, and to just, let go. And yeah, we are supposed to forgive people, but that doesn't mean that you keep going back to a priest who has been compromised, basically. You live and you learn. If you see that somebody is not going to do all for God, then you know they're compromised. And why would you continue to go back? It's the same thing with the priests in the Catholic system. You know that some priests are pedophiles. There's accusations, obviously, lawsuits and things like that, and people still keep. But they're a priest. But they're a priest. You know. On page 39, uh, they were this Peter was saying that 3 or 4 years of penance will cure even the most egregious lapses. And meanwhile, virtually no one is to be excluded from communion with other believers. Once again, we're talking about communion, things that, you know, we're not supposed to penance. I mean, if you ask for forgiveness, you're forgiven. If you're truly repentant, you're forgiven then. The fact that they're even talking about, um, you know, having years of penance, it's ridiculous. That's nowhere in the Bible, you know. God forgives us if you ask for forgiveness, if you've repented. What's the point? What if they died before their penance was done? I mean, it's like Catholic, which I'll get into here. Continuing on. Let's see here. The same standards, more or less, were later applied to govern the readmission of lapsed clergy to their official positions, except for the most outrageous cases of apostasy. Priests, presbyters, and bishops were to be forgiven and restored to office after doing appropriate penance. The principle Peter sought to establish was that the right and power to act as a priest did not depend upon the priest's personal holiness, but upon the sanctity of his office. This approach viewed persecution as abnormal and looked forward to the time when the church would be a stable, bureaucratically administered organization. The problem was that a priest's personal morality could not be made entirely irrelevant to his competence to perform the duties of his office. To the Donatists, the corruption of the traitors and apostates, which stank in the nostrils of God, had robbed them of all spiritual credibility and moral authority. By insisting that only their uncompromised bishops and priests had true authority, they effectively substituted their churches for the Catholic, i.e., universal, church, and introduced a new and explosive cause of conflict into the Christian community, the issue of schism. Basically, what that was saying was that the Christians in that time considered themselves all one church, the Catholic or universal church. So, what I'm wondering is, when did they become the Catholic universal church? When did they start taking communion? When did they start doing things like penances that weren't in the Bible? You know, it's just frustrating to wonder, where did our religion go? You know, they died, basically. The true people who had complete faith and knew that they would see Jesus when they died, they were willing to be martyrs, and happily so. And the people who weren't, that's where our religion comes from, because they're the survivors. So it's really very sad that the people who weren't willing to give in, who were weak, they're the ones who are surviving. And that's what's happening too in our country right now, the United States. There are so many Christian church buildings. They're not the church. We are the church, the people. But there's so many Christian church buildings and leaders, priests and bishops and pastors and everything, all getting together with this Together 2016 and various other things together, to bring the denominations back together, to get rid of the schisms. They want to reset back to that time where there was a Catholic Church. They are weak. And that's who people are looking up to right now. The people who are strong in faith, they're not going to church buildings anymore. They know that there's nothing worthwhile holding on to these doctrines of men. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for listening and have a blessed day.